So the project that we're doing for the February 2016 knit along is a pair of fingerless mitts, and we're doing those 2 at a time using the magic loop method. What is the magic loop? It's a way to knit in the round, particularly on small projects like hats and gloves and other things that are going to be smaller than a circular needle, that allows you to not have to use double pointed needles. There's a lot of advantages here, one of them being that it does allow you to work on 2 things at the same time. So if you're working on socks or gloves, really handy because you don't have to go back and then repeat everything you've just done in order to make a second sock. Now, the way that this works is you have to use a circular needle with a very long cable. Minimum really is about 40 inches. The ones we got for the class have 48 inches, and that extra length is really helpful when you're working with something 2 at a time. So if you can see here, what I have is half of my stitches on one side of the needle, and I have the other half of the stitches on the other side. And my cable is just sort of looped around, and so I've got all this extra in between the tips of the needles and the midpoint of the circular cable. So the way that you knit this is you simply knit across one glove, you drop that yarn, you pick up the yarn from the second ball, you knit across that way, then you're actually going to turn the whole thing around, readjust your cables, and do the same thing in reverse. And so every time that you actually have to make a change to the position of your needles, that's 1/2 round. So if you want to think of it as quarters, right? There's the first quarter, second quarter, you'll turn and do the third quarter and the fourth quarter. So let's look at that in action. So in order to begin knitting, I start usually, anytime I put my project down, I start with the needles being about right here. And then to start a row, I'm going to notice, okay, here's my yarn, so I need to start knitting onto this needle first. I'm going to push it up to the tip of the needle and then pull the other cable about halfway through so that I have enough room to pull it and meet it right here. And then I'm just going to start knitting, just like normal. But what I'm doing is I'm actually using the excess cable to kind of hold everything in place. And this is very similar to double pointed needles, except instead of having to use 3 or 4, you have to use only 1 cable. And you're simply using the fact that the cable is flexible and can be bent and twisted in order to give you this extra room. So I'm just going across, and there's nothing different about this than any other kind of knitting. Same exact steps. And now the difference is going to come because I'm doing 2 at a time. Right now I'm working with my first ball of yarn. When I'm ready to switch to the second quarter or the second glove or mitt, what I'm going to do is drop this yarn, push my second mitt up to the position on the needles, and pick up the yarn from that ball. But again, I'm just going to work all the way across, knitting just like normal. As I approach the end of the second quarter and I'm halfway through my rounds for both mitts, I'm going to switch the position of my needles. And the way that I do that is just to turn the whole setup 180 degrees. Then I'm going to pull my extra cable out. Do you remember that position we started out at where we have the 2 needles like this and the gloves pushed up against them here? Same thing, only now I'm going to push up to this needle tip, pull this one through, loop it back around, and start knitting. Now, one thing that is always a concern, whether you're using double pointed needles or the magic loop method, is your joins. So this row between here, where that's actually between the stitch here and the stitch here can sometimes be pulled a little bit loose, and people do get concerned about that creating a visible line in the finished work. And honestly, the best thing to do to avoid that is for your first 2 stitches of the row, just be a little bit more tight than you normally would. Normally I would never tell you to actually pull and tug your yarn to make it tight, but when you're working with something in the round like this and you have a separation between 2 stitches, it's going to naturally get pulled more loosely, and so I would recommend tightening those first 2 stitches for every time you start knitting, in order to keep that from growing and getting worse. So what we have here is these set up to do magic loop. I'm about at the halfway point of the glove here. Very, very long circular needle. This one has a 48-inch cable. And as you can see, they're split perfectly in half. So I have half the stitches on this side, and the other half the stitches on this side. And I'm always going to have extra cable pulled out so that those 2 will never meet until the glove is complete. You might wonder why I have a safety pin stuck here. The reason is just so I know where my starting spot is. A stitch marker is harder to use with magic loop because of how often you're messing with the needles. So I actually prefer to just put a safety pin in the bottom of the first glove, so I know that this is where my start of round is.